Hello and welcome to this video where we are going to discuss the chapter 5 discussion. And in this chapter, it is a bit tricky how to structure it because there are many possibilities. It depends a lot on how you structure your problematization, how you structure your literature review, also your findings. So I'll try to give you some ideas of how to write it, the structure of it. I will give you an example. But let's take a look at what that chapter has to have. I think in very simple terms, this chapter is an overlap between your findings, chapter 4, and your literature review, chapter 2. So it's basically trying to say, this is what I found, this is what was supposed to happen, what is similar, what is different, can I add more explanation to what we knew will happen? Can I new can I add a new story on something we didn't know will happen? So that's basically the spirit of this chapter. But also I have to tell you that in my opinion, or I think everyone's opinion who is writing research, this chapter is a bit tricky. It's not that easy to identify, A and B are different, and it's because of this. I mean, it's a bit tricky to write it. So let me give you some suggestions on how to write it. Let's take a look at the questions that you are supposed to answer with in this chapter. So, based on your findings and overlapping with previous literature, what theoretical assumptions can you expand or challenge? So maybe there are some things that you found that they are the same as what we will expect will happen. For example, in technology literacy, I think we will expect that people who can use technology better will use AI too because it makes sense, right? So I think you kind of proved that assumption, but can you add an explanation that maybe we didn't know before? Is there something new that maybe we didn't know before? How do your findings differ, or are they more complex than the literature suggests? So maybe, for example, the sustainability awareness, maybe it is surprising that I think in the quant part we found some, at least in one model, the relationship is positive. So maybe that is a bit surprising. Maybe that contradicts previous assumptions that people will not use AI because AI uses a lot of electricity. I think maybe that's in your problematization. So maybe you challenge that or you make it more complex. Like maybe there are different levels, like electricity is one thing, but maybe it can make in the long term, it actually has less impact than other approaches. So I mean, like maybe you have a more complex answer to that. How do your findings close the knowledge gap identified in chapter 1? I think this is also important that you don't forget that in chapter 1 you claimed there was a research gap or a research problem. How are your findings contributing to close that gap or to answer to that problem? Also reflect on that. And how do your findings illuminate the theoretical framework you discussed in chapter 2? I think if you manage to create a framework in like a map, visual map of what the literature talks about, I think we have discussed this in the workshops and tutoring. Now maybe you can expand that framework. What are your findings adding to that, or what are your findings explaining on that model? So maybe you can expand that model. So in terms of suggestions on how to structure it, I think one possibility is also to divide the discussion in the quant, like the implications from the quant findings. So one section could be based on the quant finding, support, reject, partial support, partial reject. This is what we have learned, and this is what is similar or what is different against previous literature. So that is one possible section. It doesn't have to be that long. 1 or 2 paragraphs is enough. And then maybe a qualitative section where you discuss how your qualitative findings maybe add more complexity, maybe you identified things that are new, maybe things that didn't exist before. And maybe you can add in a final subsection, like a third subsection, maybe you can just combine, like if eh, you proved something, you have one point in the quant discussion, and maybe you have other points in the qual. So what is the overall kind of contribution? That's a possibility on how you can write it. If you don't see it's that clear how you can contribute from quant and from qual, and maybe it's better if you combine. For example, maybe your quant findings are telling you something that is very linear, like For example, the technology literacy, yes, it is positive, and maybe you think you don't have enough to talk about that. Like maybe you think it's too simple. Maybe report that, but immediately, like in the same section, you have to have another section for qual. Immediately use your qual to elaborate more complexity on that simple acceptance of the hypothesis. And for the technology literacy groups, don't take it like as an order. Like if you have technology literacy, you have to do only one section combined. No, maybe you can find a way to elaborate that the quantitative findings are surprising in a way or are or even if they support what was previously said, uh, th this support clarifies a lot of confusion that we had before. Maybe that's how you problematize your topic. So maybe that clarification is what can be discussed in the quantitative subsection, and then in the qualitative, you discuss the complexity. So I think it's hard because there is no clear path of how to do it. I also think you need to do some iteration, like maybe write and rewrite a little bit. And very importantly, take note of this. Maybe you would like to go back to the literature review or to the introduction and reframe or revise a little bit what you have written before, because maybe you have an answer to something that you didn't highlight before. Like maybe technology is so important, but before you didn't mention it that much. So maybe you want to come back, return, and highlight that technology is a big problem because you have the answer to it with technology. So it's also a good approach. Let's take a look at what they did in the good example. So I think they follow the idea of the small section. So they have a hypothesis conclusion or hypothesis discussion. So they focus on what the quantitative findings add to the theoretical discussion, then the qualitative discussion, and finally, kind of overall theoretical contribution thing. This chapter, difference with the findings chapter, is very heavily based also on previous research because you are combining a lot, like what someone said before you and what you're adding to that conversation. So that's why you have more references. Like in the findings, you only have methodological references, but in here you have a lot of uh, literature references. So I think that's it for the discussion. The good news is that the conclusion is much easier to write. I will talk about it in the next bit.